MKUltra CIA mind control experiments. So here's a fun fact. Your government once spent serious money trying to figure out how to control people's minds, not in a sci-fi movie, in real life. MKUltra was a top-secret CIA program that ran from the early 1950s to 1973. The goal? Develop techniques for mind control and interrogation. They wanted to create truth serums, erase memories, and basically turn people into programmable robots. You know, normal government stuff. The CIA dumped LSD on everyone they could get their hands on. Sometimes people knew about it. Often they didn't. They dosed their own agents, military personnel, doctors, prostitutes, prisoners, and random civilians. Just slipped it into drinks at parties to see what would happen. One guy, Frank Olson, jumped out a window to his death after being secretly drugged. His family was told it was just a tragic accident. Oops. But it wasn't just acid trips. MKUltra included sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and sexual abuse, and various forms of torture disguised as experiments. They funded research at universities and hospitals, so respected institutions were unknowingly or knowingly helping the CIA mess with people's brains. Here's where the cover-up gets spicy. In 1973, when CIA Director Richard Helms got wind that people might start asking questions, he ordered most MKUltra files destroyed, just burned them, thousands of documents gone, making it nearly impossible to know the full scope of what happened. We only know about MKUltra because of two things. Some financial records survived, because accountants never throw anything away, and a congressional investigation in 1975 called the Church Committee started digging into shady CIA operations. Suddenly, the agency had to admit they'd been running illegal human experiments for decades. The fallout was significant but weirdly incomplete. There were hearings, public outrage, and some compensation for victims. But because most records were destroyed, countless victims never got acknowledgement or justice. We'll never know everyone who was involved or harmed. MKUltra sits at number 1 because it combines everything disturbing about government overreach, illegal experimentation on citizens, zero accountability, deliberate destruction of evidence, and activities that sound too crazy to be real, but absolutely were. It shattered trust and proved that conspiracy theories sometimes don't go far enough. The program officially ended in 1973, but it left a permanent stain on how people view government secrecy. Watergate Scandal, White House Illegal Spying. The Watergate scandal is basically the gold standard for political cover-ups. It's the one that added "gate" to every scandal that came after. Got caught doing something shady? Congrats, it's now whatever gate. It started small in June 1972. 5 guys got arrested breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. They were planting bugs and photographing documents. Weird, but it could have been written off as random political dirty tricks. Except these weren't random operatives. They had direct ties to President Nixon's re-election campaign. Nixon and his crew immediately went into cover-up mode. They denied everything, paid hush money to the burglars, and used the CIA to try blocking the FBI's investigation. Nixon won re-election in a landslide months later, so initially, the plan seemed to work. But 2 reporters from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, wouldn't let it go. With help from an anonymous source called Deep Throat, later revealed to be FBI's Mark Felt, they kept digging. Their reporting exposed a massive web of illegal activities, wiretapping, breaking into offices, using campaign funds for sabotage, enemies lists, the whole authoritarian playbook. The Senate launched hearings in 1973, which were televised and absolutely riveting. Americans watched as Nixon's aides testified about recorded conversations in the Oval Office. Those tapes became the smoking gun. Nixon refused to hand them over, claiming executive privilege. When he finally did, there was a suspicious 18.5-minute gap. Someone had clearly erased something incriminating. The tapes that survived were damning enough. They proved Nixon knew about the cover-up and actively participated in it. The House started impeachment proceedings. Rather than face certain removal from office, Nixon resigned in August 1974, the only U.S. president to ever do so. His successor, Gerald Ford, immediately pardoned him for any crimes he might have committed. No jail time, no real consequences for Nixon personally, though several of his top aides went to prison. Watergate fundamentally changed American politics. It proved the president wasn't above the law. Mostly, empowered investigative journalism and made everyone way more cynical about government. Every political scandal since gets measured against it. The break-in was stupid and unnecessary. Nixon was already winning, but the arrogance and criminality it revealed still echoes today. The Pentagon Papers government lying about Vietnam War. Picture this. You're an American in 1971, and your government has been sending young men to die in Vietnam for over a decade. You're told it's going well, that victory is around the corner, that the sacrifice matters. Then you find out they've been lying the entire time. That's what the Pentagon Papers revealed. This was a massive, top-secret study commissioned by Defense Secretary Robert McNamara in 1967. He wanted an honest internal history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. What the researchers produced was 7,000 pages of devastating truth. 4 administrations, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, had systematically lied to the public and Congress about the war. The documents showed the government knew the war was probably unwinnable as early as the 1960s. They revealed secret bombing campaigns, covert operations in neighboring countries, and deliberate escalation despite internal doubts. Meanwhile, officials publicly claimed progress and victory were inevitable. Daniel Ellsberg, a military analyst who worked on the study, became increasingly troubled by what he'd read. He'd been a war supporter turned skeptic after seeing the death and destruction firsthand. In 1971, he secretly photocopied the papers and leaked them to the New York Times. When the Times started publishing excerpts, the Nixon administration lost its mind. They got a court injunction to stop publication, claiming national security risks. The Times fought back, and the Washington Post picked up the baton. The case went to the Supreme Court, which ruled 6-3 in favor of the newspapers. Major win for press freedom. Nixon, already paranoid, created a special unit called the Plumbers to stop leaks. They broke into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office looking for dirt to discredit him. These same guys later got caught at Watergate. Funny how these things connect. The Pentagon Papers didn't technically reveal current military secrets. They covered events up to 1968, but they destroyed public trust. Americans realized their government had deliberately misled them about a war that killed over 58,000 U.S. troops and millions of Vietnamese. Ellsberg was charged under the Espionage Act, but the case was dismissed due to government misconduct. He became a hero to anti-war activists and a traitor to others. The leak didn't end the war immediately. That took until 1975, but it accelerated opposition and skepticism. It established that government claims about war needed serious scrutiny, not blind acceptance. Decades later, those lessons still matter. Tuskegee syphilis, experiments on Black Americans. Sometimes the cruelty is the point. That's the only way to understand what happened in Tuskegee, Alabama, between 1932 and 1972. The U.S. Public Health Service recruited 600 black men, mostly poor sharecroppers. They told them they were receiving free health care for bad blood, a vague term covering various ailments. In reality, 399 of them had syphilis, and the government wanted to study what happens when the disease goes completely untreated. Let that sink in. Researchers didn't give these men syphilis. They already had it, but they never told them their actual diagnosis. They never treated them, even when penicillin became the standard widely available cure in the 1940s. For 40 years, doctors watched these men suffer, go blind, lose their minds, and die, all while taking detailed notes. The men thought they were receiving treatment. They got placebos, spinal taps disguised as special treatments, and regular checkups, not to help them, but to document the disease's progression. Researchers actively prevented them from getting real treatment elsewhere. When World War II draft boards wanted to treat men before military service, the study's doctors intervened to keep their subjects untreated. The wives contracted syphilis. Children were born with congenital syphilis. The damage spread while government doctors watched and recorded. This wasn't some rogue operation in a basement. It was official, funded, and involved the Centers for Disease Control. Medical papers were published in journals. Colleagues knew. Nobody stopped it. The study finally ended in 1972, not because of internal ethics, but because a whistleblower named Peter Buxton leaked it to the press. The public was horrified. There were congressional hearings, lawsuits, and eventually a formal apology from President Clinton in 1997, 25 years after it ended, 65 years after it started. The survivors and their families received a settlement, but money doesn't undo decades of betrayal and suffering. Tuskegee's legacy is profound and ongoing. It's a major reason many Black Americans distrust medical institutions and research studies. That skepticism isn't paranoia, it's learned from experience. When COVID vaccines rolled out, public health officials had to confront this history directly because Tuskegee's shadow still looms large. The study represents racism disguised as science, exploitation dressed up as research, and a government willing to sacrifice its most vulnerable citizens for data. Pure evil, dressed in lab coats. COINTELPRO FBI sabotaging activists. The FBI has always marketed itself as America's noble crime fighters, but for decades they ran a secret program that was less catch the bad guys and more destroy anyone who challenges the status quo. COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, officially ran from 1956 to 1971. The FBI targeted political organizations they deemed subversive or threatening, started with communists during the Red Scare, which was already sketchy, but it quickly expanded to civil rights groups, anti-war activists, feminist organizations, and basically anyone J. Edgar Hoover personally didn't like. The methods were straight-up dirty tricks. They infiltrated groups with informants and provocateurs. They spread false rumors to create infighting and paranoia. They sent anonymous letters to activists' spouses suggesting affairs to destroy marriages. They leaked fake documents to the press. They got people fired from jobs. They coordinated with local police to harass and falsely arrest targets. Martin Luther King Jr. was a major target. The FBI bugged his hotel rooms, recorded his private conversations, and sent him an anonymous letter suggesting he should kill himself before his extramarital affairs became public. This wasn't about criminal activity. King's crime was advocating for civil rights too effectively. The Black Panther Party got hit even harder. The FBI didn't just surveil them, they actively worked to destroy the organization. In one horrific case, They provided Chicago police with a floor plan of Fred Hampton's apartment, leading to a raid where Hampton was killed in his bed. He was 21 years old. COINTELPRO also targeted student movements, Puerto Rican independence groups, Native American activists, and the anti-war movement. If you publicly opposed government policy, you might end up on their list. None of this was legal. Much of it violated constitutional rights to free speech and assembly, but it was secret, so nobody could challenge it. The program unraveled in 1971, when activists calling themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. They stole files and leaked them to newspapers, exposing COINTELPRO's existence. The FBI was forced to officially end the program, though many suspect similar tactics just went deeper underground. Congressional investigations followed, confirming the scope of abuse. There were reforms and new oversight rules. Whether those actually stopped domestic spying on activists is debatable. COINTELPRO matters because it shows how easily national security becomes an excuse for crushing dissent. The FBI wasn't protecting Americans, they were protecting power from being challenged. NSA mass surveillance, Snowden leaks. Remember when calling someone paranoid for thinking the government was watching everything they did online actually made sense? Yeah, those were simpler times. In 2013, Edward Snowden, a contractor working for the NSA, walked out with thousands of classified documents and handed them to journalists. What they revealed was stunning. The National Security Agency had built a massive surveillance apparatus that collected data on virtually everyone, American citizens included, without warrants or oversight. The NSA was hoovering up phone records from millions of Verizon customers. They had programs with names like Prism that collected data directly from tech giants, Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft. They tapped into fiber optic cables carrying internet traffic around the world. They even hacked into Google and Yahoo's internal networks because apparently going through the front door wasn't invasive enough. This wasn't targeted surveillance of suspected terrorists. This was bulk collection of everything: emails, photos, videos, search histories, location data, who you called and when. The NSA's attitude was basically, collect it all and sort it out later. They built massive data centers in places like Utah to store the digital exhaust of entire populations. When confronted, Director of National Intelligence James Clapper straight up lied to Congress, saying the NSA didn't collect data on millions of Americans. Snowden's leaks proved that was false. Clapper later admitted he gave the least untruthful answer, which is a fancy way of saying he lied under oath. He faced zero consequences. The government's justification was counterterrorism after 9/11s. They claimed these programs stopped attacks and kept people safe. When pressed for examples, they couldn't produce many convincing ones. A review board found the bulk phone collection program had never been essential to preventing any attack. Snowden fled to Hong Kong, then Russia, where he remains in exile. The US charged him under the Espionage Act. Whether he's a traitor or a hero depends on who you ask. Civil libertarians call him a whistleblower. Intelligence officials call him a criminal who damaged national security. The leak sparked worldwide outrage and diplomatic incidents. Other countries were furious to discover the NSA had spied on their leaders, including allies like Germany's Angela Merkel. Some reforms followed. Congress passed the USA Freedom Act, ending bulk phone record collection by the NSA, supposedly. Tech companies strengthened encryption, but realistically, surveillance probably just got better hidden. The infrastructure still exists, the legal authorities remain broad, and the agencies have proven they'll push boundaries until someone stops them. Snowden showed us the watchers are always watching. We just usually don't see them back. Chernobyl meltdown, cover-up. April 26, 1986. A reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union, exploded during a safety test gone catastrophically wrong. It became the worst nuclear disaster in history, and the Soviet government's first instinct wasn't to warn people or evacuate, it was to hide it. The explosion blew the roof off Reactor 4 and sent radioactive material into the atmosphere. Firefighters rushed in with no idea they were being cooked by lethal radiation. They fought the blaze heroically. Many died within weeks from acute radiation syndrome, suffering horribly as their bodies broke down. Meanwhile, the Soviet authorities said nothing publicly, not to their own citizens, not to neighboring countries, not to the world. The nearby city of Pripyat, home to 49,000 people, wasn't evacuated for 36 hours. During that time, kids played outside, people went to work, life continued normally, while invisible poison rained down. The Soviets might have kept it quiet longer, but radiation doesn't respect borders. Monitoring stations in Sweden detected abnormal radioactivity 2 days later. When Swedish scientists started asking questions, the Soviets finally admitted something had happened, while massively downplaying the severity. Even then, the lies continued. Officials insisted everything was under control. They suppressed information about radiation levels, about contamination zones, about health risks. Doctors were forbidden from listing radiation as a cause of death. Data was classified. Scientists who wanted to study the health impacts faced obstruction. The immediate area was eventually evacuated, creating a massive exclusion zone, but countless people had already been exposed. Estimates of deaths vary wildly because the Soviets, and later independent researchers, struggled to separate radiation-related cancers from background rates. Numbers range from a few thousand to potentially hundreds of thousands when you count long-term cancer deaths across Europe. Hundreds of thousands of liquidators, workers and soldiers were sent into the disaster zone with minimal protection to clean up radioactive debris, bury contaminated soil, and build a concrete sarcophagus over the destroyed reactor. Many received dangerous radiation doses. The government tracked them poorly and downplayed their exposure. The cover-up wasn't just about protecting the Soviet Union's reputation. It was about protecting the nuclear power industry and avoiding panic. Admitting the scope of the disaster meant admitting serious design flaws in Soviet reactors and catastrophic failures in safety culture. Chernobyl contributed to the Soviet Union's collapse a few years later. It shattered public trust and exposed the rot of a system that prioritized propaganda over human life. The exclusion zone remains largely abandoned today, a radioactive monument to what happens when governments choose secrecy over safety. The disaster could have been less catastrophic if they'd told the truth immediately, but honesty wasn't exactly the Soviet government's strong suit. Area 51 denial secret aircraft programs. For decades, the US government insisted Area 51 didn't exist. You could see it on maps. Satellite photos showed buildings and runways in the Nevada desert, but officially, nothing there. Just empty desert. Move along. Area 51 became a cultural phenomenon, the go-to reference for government secrecy and alien conspiracy theories. UFO enthusiasts claimed it housed crashed alien spacecraft and extraterrestrial bodies. The government's refusal to acknowledge the base only fueled speculation. If there's nothing there, why all the secrecy? Turns out they weren't hiding aliens. They were hiding airplanes. Area 51 was, and is, a testing ground for classified aircraft. The U-2 spy plane was developed there in the 1950s, so was the SR-71 Blackbird and the F-117 stealth fighter. These were cutting-edge aircraft with capabilities the government desperately wanted kept secret from the Soviet Union and other adversaries. Many UFO sightings from the Cold War era were actually people spotting test flights of these secret planes. The U-2 could fly at altitudes nobody thought possible at the time. Commercial pilots would report seeing aircraft at 60,000 feet when everyone knew planes couldn't fly that high. The government couldn't explain what people were seeing without revealing classified programs, so they just didn't. When people reported strange lights or unusual aircraft, authorities would dismiss them, sometimes suggesting they'd seen weather balloons or natural phenomena. This wasn't entirely dishonest. They genuinely couldn't confirm secret aircraft, but it was deliberately misleading. The CIA didn't officially acknowledge Area 51's existence until 2013, when they declassified documents in response to a public records request. By then, everyone already knew it was real. The admission just confirmed what had been obvious for years. But here's the thing. The secrecy was arguably justified. During the Cold War, keeping advanced aircraft capabilities hidden from Soviet intelligence was legitimately important. The U-2 spy plane gathered crucial intelligence. Stealth technology gave the US a significant military advantage. The problem is that necessary secrecy created a credibility gap. When the government lies about things people can literally see with their eyes, it destroys trust. If they'll deny the existence of an entire military base, what else are they lying about? Area 51 also became a catch-all for government secrecy. It fed conspiracy theories about everything from alien technology to time travel to government mind control. Some of that is nonsense, but the government's extreme secrecy made it impossible to separate reasonable questions from wild speculation. The base still operates today, still testing classified aircraft, still heavily guarded. They've acknowledged it exists, but good luck getting anywhere near it. The secrecy continues, just with slightly more honest marketing. Iraq WMD false intelligence. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq based on a premise that turned out to be completely wrong, that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed an imminent threat. Secretary of State Colin Powell went before the United Nations with satellite photos, diagrams, and confident assertions about mobile biological weapons labs, aluminum tubes for nuclear centrifuges, and stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons. President Bush and other officials repeatedly warned that doing nothing risked a nuclear-armed Iraq or terrorists getting WMDs. There was just one problem. None of it was true. After the invasion, inspectors searched Iraq thoroughly. They found no weapons of mass destruction, no active nuclear program, no mobile bioweapons labs. The aluminum tubes were for conventional rockets, not nuclear centrifuges. The intelligence was based on outdated information, unreliable sources, and a lot of wishful thinking. So how did this happen? Part incompetence, part deception, part groupthink. Intelligence agencies were under pressure to find evidence supporting the case for war. Analysts cherry-picked information that fit the conclusion and ignored contradictions. A source codenamed Curveball, who claimed knowledge of bioweapons programs, turned out to be a liar. German intelligence had warned he was unreliable, but US officials used his claims anyway. The Bush administration wasn't just passively receiving bad intelligence. They actively hyped threats and presented worst-case scenarios as facts. They suggested connections between Saddam and al-Qaeda that didn't exist. They created an atmosphere where questioning the intelligence was seen as being soft on terrorism. Critics and skeptics existed. including weapons inspectors who were actually in Iraq before the invasion and found nothing, but they were sidelined or ignored. Countries like France and Germany questioned the evidence and opposed the war. They were mocked as cowards. The war went ahead. Saddam's regime fell quickly. Then came years of insurgency, sectarian violence, and chaos. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died. Nearly 4,500 U.S. troops killed, tens of thousands wounded, trillions of dollars spent. The region destabilized. ISIS eventually emerged from the wreckage. And there were never any WMDs. Was it an honest mistake or deliberate deception? Probably some of both. Some officials genuinely believed the intelligence. Others likely knew it was shaky but wanted the war anyway for other reasons. Regime change, oil, regional influence, whatever. The Iraq WMD failure destroyed American credibility internationally. It vindicated skeptics who didn't trust government claims about threats. It made future interventions harder to justify, even when intelligence might actually be solid. When you cry wolf about weapons of mass destruction and turn out to be wrong, people stop listening. The consequences of that lie are still playing out across the Middle East today. Operation Paperclip: Nazi scientists recruited secretly. World War II ended in 1945. The Nazis were defeated, their leadership put on trial at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity. Justice was served, right? Well, not exactly. While some Nazis faced consequences, others got job offers from the US government. Operation Paperclip was a secret program that brought over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to America after the war. Many had been members of the Nazi Party. Some had direct ties to war crimes. The US government knew this and recruited them anyway. Why? The Cold War was starting, and America wanted their expertise before the Soviets grabbed them. These weren't just any scientists. They'd developed the V-2 rocket, jet aircraft, and other advanced weapons technology. The thinking was, better they work for us than for Stalin. The most famous recruit was Wernher von Braun, the rocket scientist who became the face of America's space program. He designed the V-2 rocket that terrorized London during the war. Those rockets were built by slave labor at the Mittelwerk factory, where thousands of concentration camp prisoners died from brutal conditions. Von Braun knew about this. He visited the facility. He selected workers. After the war, NASA hero, key architect of the Saturn V rocket that put Americans on the moon, given medals and celebrated as a visionary. The government sanitized these scientists' backgrounds, concealing or downplaying Nazi affiliations and potential war crimes. Operation Paperclip's name itself came from the paperclips used to attach new, cleaner profiles to their files. They literally papered over the past. President Truman had authorized bringing over German scientists, but explicitly prohibited recruiting anyone who'd been active Nazis or posed security threats. The military and intelligence agencies ignored those restrictions. They wanted the expertise and figured the ends justified the means. Some recruits were probably just ordinary scientists who happened to work in Nazi Germany and had no real choice. But others actively participated in atrocities. Kurt Blom conducted human experiments. Hubertus Strughold oversaw medical experiments that killed people. Many others benefited from slave labor. For years, the program remained classified. The public didn't know that Nazi scientists were working on American military and space projects. When details eventually emerged, the government defended it as a necessary evil of the Cold War. There's an uncomfortable truth here. Operation Paperclip worked. The recruited scientists genuinely advanced American rocket technology, aerospace engineering, and military capabilities. Von Braun's contributions to the space program were real and significant. But bringing over people complicit in Nazi crimes, hiding their backgrounds, and rewarding them with prestigious careers sits uneasily against America's stated values. We prosecuted some Nazis at Nuremberg, while hiring others. The message, your past doesn't matter if you're useful enough. That's a hell of a moral compromise, even if it did help win the space race. Panama Papers' hidden global wealth. In 2016, someone leaked 11.5 million documents from a Panamanian law firm called Mossack Fonseca. It became the biggest data leak in history and exposed how the world's wealthy and powerful hide their money from taxes, investigators, and public scrutiny. The Panama Papers revealed a massive global system of offshore shell companies, secret accounts, and financial trickery. We're talking about world leaders, billionaires, celebrities, drug traffickers, arms dealers, and corrupt officials, all using the same playbook to stash cash where nobody could track it. Mossack Fonseca specialized in creating shell companies, legal entities that exist on paper but don't actually do anything except hold money and assets. Want to buy a yacht without anyone knowing it's yours? Shell company. Want to avoid taxes on your fortune? Shell company. Want to hide stolen government funds? You get the idea. The leaked documents implicated Vladimir Putin's inner circle, who'd moved billions through secretive networks. Iceland's prime minister resigned after revelations he'd hidden investments in Icelandic banks during the financial crisis. Pakistan's prime minister was eventually disqualified from office. Dozens of other politicians and public figures faced scandals across multiple continents. But here's what's particularly infuriating. Most of what the Panama Papers exposed wasn't technically illegal. The ultra-wealthy have access to lawyers and accountants who know exactly how to exploit loopholes, technicalities, and jurisdictional gaps. They play a global shell game with money, moving it through networks so complex that even when you find it, prosecuting anyone becomes nearly impossible. Some of it was definitely criminal: money laundering for cartels, sanctions evasion, corruption proceeds being hidden, but a lot of it was just aggressive tax avoidance by people who could afford to pay their fair share, but chose not to. The leak came from an anonymous source who contacted a German newspaper. Journalists from dozens of countries collaborated through the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists to analyze the documents. The scale was overwhelming. Years of data on over 214,000 shell companies and their beneficial owners. Mossack Fonseca shut down in 2018, claiming reputational damage made continuing impossible. The firm's founders were eventually arrested in Panama, though legal proceedings dragged on. Some people exposed in the papers faced consequences: investigations, resignations, prosecutions. Many others walked away unscathed, their wealth intact, and their systems barely disrupted. The Panama Papers didn't just expose individual wrongdoing. They revealed an entire shadow financial system designed to help rich people avoid accountability. Tax havens compete to offer secrecy. Banks facilitate the transfers. Lawyers and accountants build the structures. Governments look the other way because wealthy clients bring business. Meanwhile, regular people pay their taxes because their wages are reported automatically, and they can't afford fancy offshore arrangements. Big tobacco hiding smoking dangers. Cigarette companies spent decades selling a product they knew was killing their customers, while publicly insisting there was no proven health risk. That's not an exaggeration or conspiracy theory. Internal documents eventually proved they knew exactly what they were doing. By the 1950s, scientists were publishing studies linking smoking to lung cancer and other diseases. The evidence was mounting quickly. The tobacco industry's response? Deny everything and manufacture doubt about the science. Or, in 1954, major tobacco companies launched a coordinated campaign claiming that the science was inconclusive and more research was needed. They created Tobacco Industry Research Committee, which sounds like a legitimate scientific body, but was actually a public relations front designed to cast doubt on damaging research. They funded studies designed to muddy the waters and emphasize uncertainty wherever possible. The strategy was brilliant and evil. You don't have to disprove the science, just make people think the question is still open. Sow doubt, fund alternative theories, promote skeptical scientists, keep the controversy alive so smokers can tell themselves the risks aren't really proven, and keep buying cigarettes. Behind closed doors, tobacco executives knew better. Internal memos from the 1960s show company scientists confirming that cigarettes caused cancer and that nicotine was addictive. One infamous Brown-Williamson document from 1969 stated plainly, "We are then in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug." They knew nicotine was addictive and deliberately manipulated nicotine levels in cigarettes to keep customers hooked. They knew cigarettes killed people and kept selling them anyway. And they lied about all of it for decades while their customers died. When researchers found that secondhand smoke harmed non-smokers, the industry denied that too. When evidence showed smoking during pregnancy harmed babies, they denied it. When data linked smoking to heart disease, emphysema, and a dozen other conditions, they cast doubt and demanded more research. The turning point came in the 1990s, when whistleblowers leaked thousands of internal documents and state attorneys general launched massive lawsuits. The 1998 Master Settlement Agreement forced tobacco companies to pay billions to states annually and restricted marketing, especially advertising aimed at children. In 2006, a federal judge ruled that tobacco companies had violated racketeering laws by deliberately deceiving the public about smoking's dangers for decades. The court found they'd engaged in a coordinated conspiracy to defraud consumers and suppress the truth. But by then, how many people had died? Millions. How many got addicted as teenagers because the industry marketed cigarettes as cool, sophisticated, and safe? The death toll is staggering, and it happened because companies chose profit over human life, then lied about it for 50 years. Agent Orange toxicity suppressed. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. military sprayed roughly 20 million gallons of herbicides over Vietnamese forests to eliminate enemy cover and destroy crops that might feed Viet Cong fighters. The most widely used was Agent Orange, named for the orange stripe on its storage barrels. It worked great for killing plants. Unfortunately, it also poisoned millions of people. Agent Orange contained dioxin, one of the most toxic compounds humans have ever created. Even tiny amounts cause cancer, birth defects, immune system damage, neurological problems, and various other horrific health conditions. The military sprayed it from planes, boats, trucks, and helicopters across huge swaths of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia from 1961 to 1971. American soldiers handled the stuff without protective gear. They walked through recently sprayed areas, drank contaminated water, and breathed the chemical mist. Nobody told them it was dangerous. Vietnamese civilians had it worse. They lived in areas that were repeatedly doused with the herbicide. The manufacturers, primarily Monsanto and Dow Chemical, knew dioxin was toxic. Studies from the 1940s onward showed it caused serious health issues in animals and humans, but the companies didn't adequately warn the military, and when concerns were raised internally, they minimized the risks to protect their contracts. The military also knew, or should have known, that Agent Orange was dangerous. By the late 1960s, evidence of its toxicity was emerging from their own studies and reports from the field, but the spraying continued until 1971, only stopping after significant public outcry and mounting scientific evidence became impossible to ignore. When veterans started getting sick in the 1970s, unusual cancers, nerve damage, severe skin conditions, the government initially denied any connection to Agent Orange exposure. The Veterans Administration rejected disability claims systematically, insisting there was no proven link between the herbicide and their illnesses. Veterans had to fight for decades to get the government to acknowledge what had happened to them. Independent studies kept showing connections between Agent Orange exposure and various cancers, diabetes, Parkinson's disease, and other conditions. Birth defects appeared in veterans' children at elevated rates that couldn't be explained by chance. Congress finally passed the Agent Orange Act in 1991, which established a presumption that certain diseases in Vietnam veterans were service-connected, making them eligible for benefits, but it took 20 years of sick veterans fighting their own government for that recognition. The Vietnamese suffered far worse. Millions were exposed to higher concentrations over longer periods. Birth defects, cancers, and other health problems have affected multiple generations in heavily sprayed areas. The Vietnamese Red Cross estimates around 3 million Vietnamese people have suffered health problems from Agent Orange. The US government has never compensated them. My Lai Massacre, hidden by the military. On March 16, 1968, American soldiers entered the village of My Lai in South Vietnam. Over the next 4 hours, they systematically murdered around 504 unarmed civilians, elderly men, women, children, infants. They raped women and girls before killing them. They burned homes and slaughtered livestock. It was a massacre, pure and simple, and the military tried to cover it up completely. The soldiers were from Charlie Company, led by Lieutenant William Calley. They'd been told the village harbored Viet Cong fighters and that civilians would be gone by the time they arrived. When they got there, they found only civilians, farmers, families, people cooking breakfast and living their lives. No enemy combatants, no weapons cache, no resistance. The soldiers killed them anyway. They herded people into ditches and executed them with automatic weapons. They threw grenades into homes with families inside. They shot anyone they found, regardless of age. Eyewitness accounts describe soldiers shooting toddlers at point-blank range, bayoneting babies, gang-raping women and teenage girls before murdering them. A few Americans tried to stop it. Helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson Jr. saw the slaughter from the air, landed his chopper between soldiers and fleeing civilians, and threatened to shoot his fellow Americans if they continued killing. He and his crew managed to evacuate some survivors and reported the massacre to superiors immediately. And then the military buried it. The initial report claimed 128 Viet Cong killed in combat and 22 civilians accidentally killed in crossfire. Complete fabrication. Officers up the chain of command either didn't ask hard questions or actively participated in covering up what really happened. For over a year, the massacre remained hidden from the public and even from most of the military. Then Ron Ridenhour, a Vietnam veteran who'd heard about it from soldiers who were there, started writing letters to congressmen, the Pentagon, the President, and the State Department demanding an investigation. He refused to let it go. Investigative journalist Seymour Hersh picked up the story and broke it to the public in November 1969. the photographs taken by Army photographer Ronald Haberle, images of dead civilians piled in ditches, murdered children, the aftermath of horror, shocked the world and proved the massacre happened. The Army launched an investigation. 26 soldiers were initially charged with crimes related to the massacre or cover-up, but the military justice system largely failed. Most charges were dropped or dismissed on technicalities. Only Lieutenant Calley was convicted, sentenced to life in prison for murdering 22 civilians. Then even that minimal accountability evaporated. Calley's sentence was reduced repeatedly. He ultimately served 3.5 years under house arrest before being paroled. That's it. The only person convicted for a massacre that killed over 500 people served less time than many drug offenders. Iran-Contra affair. The Iran-Contra scandal had everything: secret arms deals with enemies, illegally funding rebels, shredded documents, televised hearings featuring a photogenic Marine in uniform, and a president claiming he couldn't quite remember what he knew or when he knew it. Here's the setup. In the mid-1980s, Congress had explicitly banned U.S. funding for the Contras, a rebel group trying to overthrow Nicaragua's leftist Sandinista government. The Reagan administration hated that restriction and found creative ways to ignore it. Meanwhile, Iranian-backed groups held American hostages in Lebanon. The U.S. had a strict public policy of never negotiating with terrorists or their sponsors. The Reagan administration decided to ignore that too, when convenient. Senior officials came up with a scheme that violated both policies simultaneously. They secretly sold weapons to Iran, an enemy state under strict arms embargo, hoping Iran would use its influence to free the hostages. Then they took profits from those illegal arms sales and funneled the money to the Contras in Nicaragua, directly bypassing Congress's funding ban. Two illegal operations wrapped together, each funding and enabling the other. When rumors started circulating in late 1986, the administration denied everything. Then a Lebanese magazine broke the story of arms sales to Iran. The scheme unraveled fast. Attorney General Edwin Meese confirmed that profits from arms sales had been diverted to the Contras, while claiming President Reagan knew nothing about the diversion. Oliver North, a Marine lieutenant colonel working at the National Security Council, became the face of the scandal. He'd coordinated much of the operation, shredded documents when investigations began, and lied to Congress about his activities. When hauled before televised congressional hearings, he showed up in his uniform and positioned himself as a patriot, following orders to fight communism. The big question was what Reagan knew and when. He gave contradictory statements. He claimed he'd authorized arms sales to Iran to secure hostage releases, but didn't know about diverting funds to the Contras. His diary entries and testimony from others suggested he knew more than he admitted, but nothing definitively proved it. 14 people were charged with crimes. 11 were convicted, including North and National Security Advisor John Poindexter. But most convictions were overturned on technicalities, often because they'd been granted immunity to testify before Congress, and prosecutors couldn't prove they hadn't used that testimony. President George H.W. Bush, who'd been Reagan's vice president, pardoned 6 key figures on Christmas Eve, 1992, right before leaving office. The independent counsel investigating the affair said the pardons undermined accountability for serious crimes. So despite breaking multiple laws, violating explicit congressional prohibitions, lying to the public and Congress, and destroying evidence, almost nobody faced lasting consequences. The Iran-Contra affair showed the limits of accountability when national security claims and executive power collide with laws that powerful people find inconvenient. Gulf of Tonkin fabrication. The Gulf of Tonkin incident is how the United States went to full-scale war in Vietnam, based on an enemy attack that almost certainly never happened. In August 1964, the USS Maddox, an American destroyer, was conducting intelligence operations in the Gulf of Tonkin, off North Vietnam's coast. On August 2nd, North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked it after the Maddox got close to shore during a South Vietnamese raid. The Maddox fired back, and aircraft from a nearby carrier joined the fight. Minor damage, no American casualties. A real, confirmed incident. 2 days later, on August 4th, the Maddox and another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, reported a second attack. Sonar operators detected torpedoes in the water. Radar showed enemy vessels approaching. The ships took evasive maneuvers and fired hundreds of rounds at targets in the darkness. President Johnson went on television and announced that North Vietnamese forces had launched an unprovoked attack on American ships in international waters. Congress quickly passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving the president broad authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. It became the legal foundation for the entire war. One problem: the second attack almost certainly didn't happen. The night of August 4th was dark and stormy with rough seas. Sonar operators were inexperienced and jumpy. They later admitted they might have been hearing their own ship's propellers echoing in the water, or acoustic anomalies from the weather. Radar contacts were likely weather phenomena, or equipment malfunctions. No enemy vessels were ever visually confirmed. No damage to American ships. No recovered enemy torpedoes, shell fragments, or debris. Within hours of the reported attack, the task force commander sent a message expressing serious doubts. He said freak weather effects and an over-eager sonarman might have created false contacts. He recommended a complete evaluation before any further action was taken. That message of doubt reached Washington before any retaliation. Military and civilian leaders saw it. They went ahead anyway, launching retaliatory bombing raids on North Vietnam within hours. Johnson and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara presented the incident to Congress and the public as a clear-cut, unprovoked attack, conveniently omitting the substantial uncertainty and contradictory evidence. Years later, declassified documents and testimony from McNamara himself confirmed the second attack probably didn't happen. NSA intercepts initially cited as proof were later revealed to be misinterpreted or referred to the August 2nd attack, not August 4th. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution passed with only 2 dissenting votes in Congress. It gave the president essentially a blank check for war in Southeast Asia. Over the next decade, more than 58,000 American troops and millions of Vietnamese died in a war that escalated from a naval incident that probably never occurred. When the truth emerged through the Pentagon Papers and later declassifications, it was too late to matter. Flint Water Crisis Cover-Up. In April 2014, the city of Flint, Michigan, struggling financially and under state-appointed emergency management, switched its water source from Detroit system to the Flint River to save money. Almost immediately, residents complained the water looked brown, smelled strange, and tasted weird. Officials repeatedly told them it was safe to drink. It wasn't safe. The water was poisoning them with lead. The Flint River is more corrosive than the previous Detroit water source. When the city failed to add corrosion control treatment, a basic, standard, inexpensive procedure required for corrosive water, the water started leaching lead from old pipes throughout the system. Lead levels in the water and in children's blood skyrocketed across the city. Lead is a potent neurotoxin that causes irreversible developmental damage, learning disabilities, and behavioral problems, especially in young children. Residents complained loudly about rashes, hair loss, mysterious illnesses, and disgusting brown water flowing from their taps. They organized community meetings and demanded answers and action. Officials from the city and state repeatedly dismissed their concerns, insisting the water met federal safety standards, and the complaints were overblown. General Motors stopped using Flint water in their engine plant because it was corroding metal parts. Somehow, officials still insisted it was fine for humans to drink. Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, a local pediatrician, started systematically testing children's blood lead levels and found alarming increases after the water switch. When she presented her findings publicly, state officials tried to discredit her research, her methodology, and her credibility, calling her data unreliable. Researchers from Virginia Tech conducted independent testing of Flint's water and found dangerously high lead levels in numerous homes. Still, officials resisted acknowledging a crisis. They accused outside researchers of causing unnecessary hysteria. Internal emails later revealed officials knew about the lead problem much earlier than they admitted, but actively downplayed or hid the evidence. The cover-up finally crumbled in fall 2015, when overwhelming evidence from multiple sources forced officials to admit Flint's water were contaminated with lead. The state acknowledged the crisis, and the city switched back to Detroit water. But the damage was done. Thousands of children had been exposed to toxic lead levels during critical developmental years. The impacts are permanent. Lead exposure causes lower IQ, behavioral problems, learning disabilities, developmental delays, and health issues that last a lifetime. An entire generation of Flint's children had their futures compromised because officials prioritized cost savings over public health. Criminal charges were filed against 15 officials, including Michigan's health director, for involuntary manslaughter, misconduct, and other crimes. Some cases resulted in plea deals, many were dismissed on procedural grounds, and true accountability remained elusive. The crisis also caused a deadly Legionnaire's disease outbreak linked to the contaminated water system that killed at least 12 people. Officials knew about the outbreak, while publicly claiming the water was perfectly safe. Exxon knew about climate change. Exxon's own scientists told company executives in the late 1970s and early 1980s that burning fossil fuels was increasing atmospheric CO2 and would cause global warming with potentially catastrophic consequences. Internal documents show Exxon researchers accurately predicted future temperature increases and climate impacts decades before it became a major public concern. So what did Exxon do with this groundbreaking, important information from their own scientists? They buried it and spent the next 3 decades funding climate change denial. Investigative journalists from Inside Climate News and the Los Angeles Times uncovered internal Exxon documents and published them in 2015. The papers showed that Exxon's own climate models from the early 1980s were remarkably accurate. Their predictions aligned closely with what actually happened. Scientists on the company's payroll clearly warned executives that climate change was real, human-caused, and potentially devastating. One 1982 internal Exxon memo stated that the environmental consequences of rising CO2 could be catastrophic and might affect the habitability of the planet for humans. Exxon scientist James Black told executives in 1977 that there was general scientific agreement that increased atmospheric CO2 from burning fossil fuels was causing global warming. Exxon even factored climate change into its own business planning. They designed oil rigs and facilities to account for rising sea levels and melting Arctic ice. Internally, They accepted the science as real and planned accordingly. Publicly, they did the exact opposite. Starting in the late 1980s and through the 1990s, as climate science gained public attention and calls for regulation grew, Exxon began funding organizations and researchers that cast doubt on climate change. They sponsored research disputing the scientific consensus. They lobbied aggressively against climate regulations. Their public relations campaigns emphasized scientific uncertainty and questioned whether global warming was really happening or whether human activity actually caused it. This was the big tobacco playbook all over again. Your own scientists tell you the truth, but instead of acting responsibly or warning the public, you manufacture doubt to protect short-term profits. Other oil companies knew too. Internal documents show Shell, BP, Chevron, and others all had research indicating fossil fuels were changing the climate. Some briefly acknowledged the problem publicly in the 1990s, then backtracked under industry pressure and coordination. The strategy worked for decades. While scientific consensus on climate change solidified among actual climate scientists, public opinion remained divided, partly because of industry-funded disinformation campaigns. Meaningful climate policy was delayed year after year, decade after decade, as the window for preventing the worst impacts narrowed. Now we're living with the consequences Exxon's own scientists predicted 40 years ago. Temperatures are rising, extreme weather is worsening, sea levels are climbing, ecosystems are collapsing. The predicted catastrophic impacts are beginning to unfold. Exxon and other fossil fuel companies now face lawsuits from cities, states, and other entities seeking damages for climate impacts and alleging the companies knowingly deceived the public for decades. Whether they'll face real accountability remains uncertain. The Olympic Russian doping program. Russia didn't just have some athletes who cheated by taking performance-enhancing drugs. They ran a sophisticated state-sponsored doping program, so elaborate and brazen, it sounds like a spy movie plot, complete with secret laboratories, midnight sample swaps, FSB intelligence agents, and a doping conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Russian government. For years, Russian athletes dominated international competitions, racking up suspicious numbers of medals at Olympics and World Championships. Turns out, a significant number were chemically enhanced, and the Russian government was coordinating, funding, and protecting the entire operation. The scheme involved giving athletes cocktails of banned performance-enhancing drugs, then using an elaborate system to beat drug testing protocols. Russian anti-doping officials, the people whose job was catching cheaters, were actively helping athletes cheat instead. Coaches, lab directors, sports ministers, and intelligence agents worked together to defeat the international testing system. The methods were absurdly sophisticated. At the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics, held in Russia, giving them home field advantage, authorities built a secret anti-doping laboratory with a hidden room. During the night, FSB agents would pass dirty urine samples through a concealed hole in the wall. Lab workers would swap them with clean sample that had been collected from the athletes months earlier and frozen. They even figured out how to open supposedly tamper-proof sample collection bottles without leaving evidence, replacing tainted urine with clean samples. Dr. Grigory Rodchenkov, the director of Russia's anti-doping laboratory and a central figure in the conspiracy, helped run the operation for years. He personally developed a 3-drug steroid cocktail that athletes would take to enhance performance, then helped them systematically avoid detection through sample swapping and data manipulation. Then Rodchenkov fled to the United States in 2016 and became a whistleblower. He exposed the entire scheme in extensive detail: how it worked, who was involved, which athletes were doping, how samples were swapped. His testimony, supported by extensive investigations and forensic evidence, revealed the staggering scope of the conspiracy. The World Anti-Doping Agency launched investigations that confirmed Rodchenkov's account. Forensic analysis of sample bottles showed physical evidence of tampering, scratch marks from tools used to open them. Data recovered from the Moscow laboratory revealed years of cover-ups, manipulated results, and disappeared samples. Russia was eventually banned from competing as a country at the 2018 Winter Olympics, though individual Russian athletes who could prove they were clean were allowed to compete under a neutral Olympic flag without Russian symbols. But the punishments felt inadequate given the scale of systematic cheating. Russia's government denied everything, calling it a Western conspiracy against Russian athletes. They claimed Rodchenkov was a rogue actor and that evidence was fabricated. They attacked the whistleblower and investigators rather than acknowledging the fraud. Athletes from other countries who lost medals and opportunities to doped Russians had their careers permanently affected. A clean athlete who finished fourth while the top three were cheating doesn't get those years back. Enron accounting fraud. Enron was once America's seventh largest company, a Houston-based energy and commodities giant, praised as innovative and forward-thinking. Fortune magazine named it America's most innovative company for 6 consecutive years. Wall Street analysts loved it. The stock price soared. Then in 2001, it collapsed almost overnight in one of the most spectacular corporate frauds in American history. Executives had been systematically cooking the books for years, using accounting tricks, special-purpose entities, and off-the-books partnerships to hide billions in debt and inflate profits. The company looked wildly successful on paper while actually hemorrhaging money. It was an elaborate house of cards built on deception. They used special-purpose entities, complicated financial structures that technically weren't part of Enron's main books, to dump debt and failing investments where they wouldn't show up on the balance sheet that investors and regulators saw. They used mark-to-market accounting to book projected future profits from deals immediately, even when those profits might never materialize. They manipulated energy markets in California and other states, deliberately creating artificial shortages to drive up prices and profits. Enron's top executives got obscenely rich. CEO Kenneth Lay, CFO Andrew Fastow, and others sold hundreds of millions in stock, while simultaneously telling employees and outside investors the company was thriving and the stock was a great buy. Employees' 401k retirement accounts were heavily invested in Enron stock, which they were actively encouraged and sometimes effectively required to hold. When the fraud was exposed, that stock became worthless paper. Whistleblowers tried raising alarms internally. Sharon Watkins, an Enron vice president, sent a letter to CEO Lay in August 2001, warning that the company would implode in a wave of accounting scandals if the accounting tricks weren't fixed. Nothing changed. The fraud continued until external pressure made it impossible to sustain. When the truth started emerging in fall 2001, Enron's stock price collapsed from over $90 per share to less than $1 in a matter of weeks. The company filed for bankruptcy in December 2001, the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history at that time. More than 20,000 employees lost their jobs, and for many, their retirement savings simultaneously. Arthur Andersen, one of the world's 5 largest accounting firms and Enron's auditor, was deeply complicit. They'd approved Enron's fraudulent financial statements for years, and when investigators started asking questions, Employees shredded thousands of documents. Anderson was convicted of obstruction of justice. The conviction was later overturned on appeal, but the firm had already collapsed, putting 85,000 people worldwide out of work. Criminal trials followed for Enron executives. Fasto pleaded guilty to fraud charges and testified against others. Lay and CEO Jeffrey Skilling were both convicted on multiple counts. Lay died before sentencing. Skilling got 24 years in prison, later reduced to 14 years, and was released in 2019. The Enron scandal led to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, which imposed stricter financial reporting requirements and tougher penalties for corporate fraud, fundamentally changing corporate governance and accountability standards. Cambridge Analytica, Facebook data manipulation. Ever take one of those fun Facebook quizzes to find out which Disney character you are, or what your personality type is? Congrats, you might have helped elect a president and swing a national referendum. Cambridge Analytica was a political consulting firm that harvested personal data from roughly 87 million Facebook users without their knowledge or consent, then used it to build psychological profiles for targeted political advertising. This wasn't some minor privacy violation. It was industrial-scale data theft that influenced major democratic elections. Here's how it worked. In 2014, a researcher named Alexander Kogan created a personality quiz app on Facebook called This Is Your Digital Life. About 270,000 people downloaded it and took the quiz. But here's the trick. The app didn't just collect data from people who took the quiz. It also scraped data from all their Facebook friends who hadn't consented to anything. Facebook's platform at the time allowed this kind of data collection. The app vacuumed up information from users' profiles, likes, locations, and friend networks. Kogan passed all this data to Cambridge Analytica, violating Facebook's terms of service, but facing no immediate consequences. Cambridge Analytica used the data to build detailed psychological profiles of voters, identifying personality types and which messages would be most effective at influencing them. They worked on Ted Cruz's presidential primary campaign, then Trump's 2016 general election campaign. They also worked on the Brexit campaign in the UK. The firm boasted about using the data to micro-target voters with personalized political messages designed to manipulate their behavior. Different people saw different ads based on their psychological profiles, messages crafted to exploit fears, biases, and emotions. Facebook knew about the data breach as early as 2015, when journalists started asking questions. The company asked Cambridge Analytica to delete the data. Cambridge Analytica said they did. Facebook never verified it and didn't tell users their data had been compromised. The scandal finally broke publicly in 2018, when whistleblower Christopher Wiley went to journalists and explained exactly what had happened. The revelations caused a massive uproar. Facebook's stock tanked. Mark Zuckerberg had to testify before Congress and the European Parliament. Cambridge Analytica shut down shortly after, though former employees claimed they just rebranded and continued similar work under different names. Facebook faced billions in fines from regulators in the US and Europe for privacy violations. The scandal exposed how personal data can be weaponized for political manipulation at scale. Those harmless-seeming apps and quizzes, data collection tools, those perfectly targeted political ads that seem to know exactly what bothers you, psychological manipulation based on your digital footprint. The worst part is that Cambridge Analytica was probably just one of many firms doing similar things. They got caught, but the underlying business model, surveillance capitalism, and data exploitation continues virtually unchanged. Facebook rebranded to Meta, paid some fines, and moved on. Boeing 737 MAX software cover-up. Boeing is one of the most respected aircraft manufacturers in history, building planes that millions of people trust with their lives every day. Then they designed a plane with a dangerous software flaw, hid it from pilots and regulators, and 346 people died in two almost identical crashes. The 737 MAX was Boeing's answer to competition from Airbus. They wanted to make the plane more fuel efficient by installing bigger engines, but those larger engines changed the aircraft's aerodynamics, making the nose tend to pitch up during certain flight conditions, which could cause a stall. Instead of redesigning the plane or requiring extensive pilot retraining, both expensive and time-consuming, Boeing created a software fix called MCAS, Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. MCAS would automatically push the nose down if sensors detected the plane was at risk of stalling. Sounds reasonable, except Boeing made critical decisions that turned MCAS into a death trap. The system relied on data from a single angle of attack sensor. If that sensor malfunctioned and gave bad data, MCAS would push the nose down based on false information. Boeing also made MCAS far more powerful than they told regulators, allowing it to move the horizontal stabilizer much more than originally described. Worse, Boeing didn't properly inform pilots that MCAS existed. It wasn't thoroughly covered in training. The system wasn't even mentioned in the flight manual initially. Pilots flying the 737 MAX didn't know the plane had software that could repeatedly force the nose down based on a single faulty sensor. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 crashed into the Java Sea, killing all 189 people aboard. Investigators found that a faulty sensor triggered MCAS, which repeatedly pushed the nose down, while pilots fought to regain control. They didn't know what was happening because Boeing hadn't told them about MCAS. Boeing and the FAA didn't ground the 737 MAX. They issued guidance about the issue, but let the planes keep flying. 5 months later, on March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed shortly after takeoff, killing all 157 people aboard. Same problem: faulty sensor, MCAS engaging repeatedly, pilots fighting a system they didn't fully understand. After the second crash, the 737 MAX was finally grounded worldwide. Investigations revealed Boeing had prioritized speed and cost savings over safety. Internal messages showed employees mocking regulators and admitting the plane had problems. One Boeing employee texted a colleague, "This airplane is designed by clowns, who in turn are supervised by monkeys." Boeing had pressured the FAA to allow minimal pilot training differences from older 737 models, because extensive retraining would make the MAX less attractive to airlines. They downplayed how much MCAS could move the stabilizer. They didn't require redundant sensors. Boeing eventually paid over $2.5 billion in settlements and fines, including compensation to airlines and families of crash victims. The MAX was grounded for nearly 2 years, while Boeing fixed the software and training requirements. The company's CEO resigned. But here's the thing: the crashes were entirely preventable. If Boeing had been honest about MCAS, required proper training, and used redundant sensors like basic safety practices demand, those 346 people would still be alive. The HIV-contaminated blood scandal. In the 1980s, thousands of people with hemophilia and others requiring blood transfusions were infected with HIV and hepatitis C through contaminated blood products. Blood banks, pharmaceutical companies, and government health agencies knew the blood supply was at risk, but failed to act quickly enough, turning a medical treatment into a death sentence. Hemophilia is a genetic disorder where blood doesn't clot properly. Treatment involves regular infusions of clotting factor, which in the 1980s was derived from pooled plasma, blood products combined from thousands of donors. If even one donor had HIV or hepatitis, the entire batch became contaminated. By the early 1980s, evidence was emerging that AIDS could be transmitted through blood. High-risk groups, including intravenous drug users and some paid plasma donors, were known to have higher infection rates. The obvious solution was to screen donors more carefully and test blood products. But testing was expensive. Donor screening would reduce the blood supply, and companies worried about profits. Pharmaceutical companies continued using high-risk blood from paid donors, including from prisons where drug use and HIV rates were elevated. Some companies exported contaminated products to other countries, even after safer products became available domestically. They knew the blood was risky but sold it anyway because throwing it away meant losing money. Countries like France, Japan, Canada, the UK, and the United States all had serious outbreaks of HIV and hepatitis C among hemophilia patients from contaminated blood products. In the US, roughly half of all people with hemophilia, about 10,000 people, were infected with HIV from clotting factor. Thousands more got hepatitis C. Blood banks and government regulators were slow to implement testing and screening. Even after HIV tests became available in 1985, some contaminated products remained in circulation. Warnings were ignored or downplayed to avoid panic and maintain blood supply. Victims were often not told they'd been infected until years later when they developed symptoms. Hemophilia patients who'd relied on blood products to manage their condition and live normal lives instead contracted fatal diseases. Many died from AIDS before effective treatments became available in the mid-1990s. The scandal played out differently across countries. In France, government officials were criminally charged for delaying implementation of HIV testing. In Japan, pharmaceutical executives were arrested. In Canada, a major inquiry led to the complete restructuring of the blood system. Victims and families fought for decades for compensation and accountability. Some countries established compensation funds. Others faced years of lawsuits. But money doesn't replace a life or undo the trauma of being infected with a deadly disease by the medical system that was supposed to help you. The contaminated blood scandal revealed how profit motives, regulatory failures, and institutional indifference can turn medical products into vectors of death. Companies knew the risks and sold the products anyway. Regulators knew the risks and moved too slowly. Thousands of people paid with their lives for those failures. The tragedy also contributed to stigma and fear around blood donation that persists today, even though modern screening and testing have made blood supplies in developed countries extremely safe. Sugar industry paying scientists to lie. For decades, we've been told that fat is the enemy, the stuff that makes you overweight and causes heart disease. Cut the fat, we were told, and you'll be healthier. This advice shaped dietary guidelines, food products, and health policy for generations. Turns out, the sugar industry paid scientists to push that narrative and deflect attention from sugar's role in disease. In the 1960s, research was emerging that linked sugar consumption to heart disease and other health problems. The sugar industry saw the threat. If Americans started blaming sugar instead of fat for health problems, their profits were in serious danger. So, they did what tobacco companies had done. They paid scientists to produce favorable research and cast doubt on damaging studies. In 2016, researchers uncovered internal sugar industry documents showing that in 1967, a sugar trade group called the Sugar Research Foundation paid 3 Harvard scientists the equivalent of about $50,000 in today's money to publish a review minimizing the link between sugar and heart disease, while emphasizing the dangers of saturated fat. The scientists, including the head of Harvard's nutrition department, published their literature review in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine. They cherry-picked studies that supported their conclusion, dismissed research linking sugar to heart disease as flawed, and pointed the finger squarely at fat instead. They didn't disclose the sugar industry funding. This wasn't just one isolated study. The sugar industry funded research programs and scientists for decades, shaping nutrition science to protect their interests. They influenced government dietary guidelines, medical recommendations, and public perception of what constitutes healthy eating. The low-fat craze that swept America from the 1980s onward was partly a result of this manipulation. Food companies removed fat from products and replaced it with sugar to maintain taste. Products labeled low-fat were marketed as healthy, even when they were loaded with sugar. Americans ate more sugar than ever while blaming fat for rising obesity and heart disease rates. The industry also attacked scientists whose research showed sugar's harms. They funded studies designed to create uncertainty. They lobbied against policies like soda taxes or limits on added sugars. They sponsored nutrition conferences and professional organizations, gaining influence over the entire field. The strategy was remarkably similar to Big Tobacco's playbook: manufacture doubt, fund friendly research, attack critics, and delay regulation for as long as possible while maintaining profits. We're still dealing with the consequences. Obesity rates have skyrocketed. Type 2 diabetes has become epidemic. Heart disease remains a leading killer. Decades of bad dietary advice, heavily influenced by industry manipulation of science, contributed to these public health disasters. When the historical documents were finally published, the sugar industry denied wrongdoing, claiming the research from the 1960s met standards of the time. Technically true. Disclosure requirements were looser then, but that misses the point. They deliberately paid for research designed to mislead the public about their products' health effects. The contamination of nutrition science by industry funding continues today across multiple food and beverage sectors. Studies funded by industry produce dramatically different results than independent research, but they're often given equal weight in public discourse. Shell's Niger Delta pollution lies. Royal Dutch Shell has been extracting oil from Nigeria's Niger Delta since the 1950s, making enormous profits from the region's resources. They've also turned parts of it into an environmental catastrophe through oil spills, gas flaring, and pollution, then lied about it for decades while fighting accountability. The Niger Delta is one of the world's largest wetlands, home to diverse ecosystems and communities that depend on fishing and farming. Shell's operations have caused extensive environmental destruction. Oil spills, from pipeline leaks, equipment failures, and sabotage, have dumped millions of barrels of crude oil into the environment. Shell consistently blamed spills on sabotage and theft by local communities, minimizing their own responsibility for corroded pipelines and poor maintenance. Independent investigations found that Shell dramatically underreported spill volumes, overstated how much oil they cleaned up, and attributed spills to sabotage that were actually caused by equipment failures. A 2011 United Nations report found that cleaning up oil contamination in Ogoniland, one heavily impacted area, could take 30 years and cost over $1 billion. Some areas had contamination 900 times above Nigerian regulatory limits. Drinking water was poisoned, farmland was destroyed, fish populations collapsed. Shell also engaged in gas flaring, burning off natural gas as a byproduct of oil extraction, at massive scale for decades. The practice releases toxic pollutants and greenhouse gases. Communities near flare sites reported health problems, including respiratory issues and cancer. The flares burned 24/7, lighting up the night sky and raining down soot. Gas flaring was banned in many countries decades ago and has been illegal in Nigeria since the 1980s, but enforcement was weak and Shell continued the practice, paying relatively small fines rather than investing in infrastructure to capture the gas. Internal documents that emerged through lawsuits showed Shell knew about the environmental damage and human rights concerns, but prioritized profits. They publicly claimed to be responsible corporate citizens, while internally acknowledging serious problems they weren't fixing. The company also faced accusations of complicity in human rights abuses. In the 1990s, Shell was accused of collaborating with Nigeria's military dictatorship to suppress protests by the Ogoni people, who were demanding environmental cleanup and fair compensation. 9 Ogoni activists, including writer Ken Saro-Wiwa, were executed by the government in 1995 after protesting Shell's operations. Shell denied involvement, but later paid $15.5 million to settle a lawsuit without admitting wrongdoing. Lawsuits against Shell have dragged on for years. A landmark case in the Netherlands found Shell's Nigerian subsidiary liable for pollution and ordered compensation and cleanup. But enforcement remains difficult, cleanup is inadequate, and impacted communities continue suffering. Shell has made public commitments to improve operations, reduce gas flaring, and address environmental damage. Progress has been slow and inadequate, according to environmental groups and affected communities. The Niger Delta situation shows what happens when multinational corporations operate in places with weak governance and can externalize environmental costs onto poor communities with little political power. Shell profited enormously while leaving behind contamination that destroyed livelihoods and health for generations. The Bhopal gas disaster downplayed. Just after midnight on December 3, 1984, a pesticide plant owned by Union Carbide in Bhopal, India, leaked roughly 40 tons of toxic gas into the surrounding community. It's considered the world's worst industrial disaster. Thousands died immediately, thousands more in the following days and weeks. The company spent decades minimizing what happened and avoiding accountability. The Bhopal plant produced carbaryl, a pesticide, using methyl isocyanate, MIC, an extremely toxic chemical. Safety systems at the plant were inadequate and poorly maintained. Cost-cutting measures had reduced staff and eliminated safety positions. Refrigeration units meant to keep MIC cool were shut off to save money. Warning systems were faulty. When water entered a storage tank containing MIC that night, it triggered a chemical reaction that released the toxic gas. It spread through densely populated neighborhoods, where thousands of poor families lived in shanties near the plant. People woke up choking, vomiting, their eyes burning. Many died in their sleep. Others stumbled outside and collapsed. Estimates of immediate deaths range from 3,800 to 16,000, depending on the source. The Indian government officially recognizes about 15,000 deaths. Over 500,000 people were exposed. Tens of thousands suffered long-term health effects, blindness, respiratory problems, neurological damage, birth defects in subsequent generations. Union Carbide's initial response was to minimize. They claimed the leak was caused by sabotage, blaming a disgruntled employee. They downplayed the toxicity of the gas and the extent of exposure. They provided inadequate information to doctors treating victims, hampering medical response. The company fought legal liability aggressively. They argued the Indian subsidiary was responsible, not the U.S. parent company. In 1989, Union Carbide settled with the Indian government for $470 million, about $500 per victim. Many victims received far less, and the compensation was widely considered inadequate for the scale of suffering. Union Carbide CEO Warren Anderson was charged with manslaughter in India, but never faced trial. He briefly visited Bhopal after the disaster, was arrested, posted bail, and left India, never to return. India's extradition requests were ignored by the US. He died in 2014, never held accountable. The plant site was never properly cleaned up. Union Carbide abandoned it, leaving behind contaminated soil and water. Toxic chemicals continued leaching into groundwater, used by local communities for decades after the disaster. Dow Chemical acquired Union Carbide in 2001 and has refused to take responsibility for Bhopal, claiming the 1989 settlement resolved all liability. Activists and victims have fought for further compensation and cleanup, with limited success. The Bhopal disaster exposed the dangers of industrial operations in developing countries with weaker safety regulations and enforcement. Union Carbide operated a hazardous facility with safety standards far below what would be acceptable in the United States. When disaster struck, the company used legal maneuvering and political influence to minimize consequences. Survivors and their families are still fighting for justice 40 years later. Health impacts persist across generations. The site remains contaminated, and the responsible companies have faced nothing approaching adequate accountability for one of history's worst industrial disasters. OxyContin. The opioid crisis. Purdue Pharma introduced OxyContin in 1996, marketing it as a breakthrough pain medication that was less addictive than other opioids. They told doctors it had a low risk of addiction. Less than 1% of patients, they claimed. They pushed it aggressively for moderate pain, not just severe or cancer-related pain. It was all lies, and those lies helped fuel an opioid epidemic that's killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. OxyContin is a powerful opioid painkiller containing oxycodone in a time-release formula. Purdue marketed the time-release mechanism as making it safer and less prone to abuse than immediate-release opioids. But people quickly discovered that crushing the pills defeated the time release, delivering the full dose at once and producing a powerful high. Purdue knew OxyContin was being abused. Reports of addiction, overdose, and illicit use started coming in shortly after the drug's release. Internal documents later revealed company executives were aware of the abuse problem, but continued marketing the drug as minimally addictive. The company deployed an army of sales representatives who visited doctors, downplaying addiction risks and encouraging prescribing for conditions like back pain and arthritis. They offered incentives to prescribe higher doses. They funded pain management advocacy groups and continuing medical education programs that promoted opioid use. Purdue's claim that addiction risk was less than 1% came from a 1980 letter to the New England Journal of Medicine that was a 5-sentence paragraph, not a rigorous study. It was based on hospitalized patients receiving short-term monitored treatment, not outpatient prescriptions for chronic pain. But Purdue used it as scientific evidence that OxyContin was safe. Doctors, many of whom received little training in pain management or addiction, prescribed OxyContin widely. Patients became addicted. When prescriptions ran out or were cut off, many turned to heroin or illicit fentanyl, cheaper and more accessible than prescription pills. The opioid epidemic exploded. Overdose deaths skyrocketed. Families were destroyed. Communities, particularly in Appalachia and the Rust Belt, were devastated as addiction rates soared. Purdue faced lawsuits from states, cities, and individuals. In 2007, the company and 3 executives pleaded guilty to criminal charges of misbranding OxyContin and paid $634 million in fines. They admitted they'd marketed the drug as less addictive and less subject to abuse than it actually was. But the misleading marketing continued for years after that conviction. Purdue only stopped promoting OxyContin to doctors in 2018, under pressure from lawsuits and public outcry. In 2019, Purdue filed for bankruptcy as part of a controversial settlement plan. The Sackler family, who owned Purdue and extracted billions in profits from OxyContin, agreed to pay roughly $6 billion over time in exchange for immunity from future civil lawsuits. Victims and advocacy groups called the deal outrageous. The Sacklers remained billionaires, while hundreds of thousands died, and millions struggled with addiction their company helped create. A bankruptcy judge initially approved the deal, giving the Sacklers immunity despite their role. Appeals challenged whether bankruptcy law could shield owners who hadn't personally filed for bankruptcy. The opioid crisis has killed over 500,000 Americans since OxyContin's introduction. It's destroyed families, overwhelmed healthcare and criminal justice systems, and created waves of orphaned children. Purdue and the Sacklers knew OxyContin was addictive, knew it was being abused, and kept marketing it as safe for years. They chose profits over lives, then used legal maneuvering to avoid full accountability. Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme, hidden for decades. Bernie Madoff ran the largest Ponzi scheme in history, defrauding investors of roughly $65 billion over at least 17 years. The really infuriating part? People tried to warn regulators repeatedly for nearly a decade, and the SEC failed to catch him despite multiple investigations. Madoff was a Wall Street legend. He'd founded a market-making firm in the 1960s that became one of the largest on Wall Street. He served on boards, was respected, and trusted. His investment advisory business promised steady, consistent returns, usually around 10 to 12% annually, regardless of market conditions. Those returns were too good to be true because they were completely fake. Madoff wasn't investing client money. He was running a classic Ponzi scheme, using money from new investors to pay returns to earlier investors, creating the illusion of profits while the whole structure required constant fresh money to avoid collapse. Red flags were everywhere. Madoff's returns were suspiciously consistent, showing gains even when markets tanked. The strategy he claimed to use didn't match the returns he reported. His operation was audited by a tiny unknown accounting firm operating out of a strip mall, not a major firm you'd expect for a multi-billion-dollar investment business. Harry Markopoulos, a financial analyst, figured out Madoff was running a fraud in 1999 after just 4 hours of examining his returns. The numbers were mathematically impossible. Markopoulos went to the SEC repeatedly over the next 9 years, providing detailed analysis, proving Madoff was a fraud. The SEC ignored him. They investigated Madoff multiple times between 1992 and 2008 and found nothing. Investigators missed obvious red flags, didn't follow up on suspicious findings, and were apparently outmatched by Madoff's reputation and connections. Some investigators were inexperienced, others seemed not to understand what they were looking at. Madoff's scheme finally collapsed in December 2008, not because regulators caught him, but because the financial crisis dried up new investment. When clients started requesting withdrawals he couldn't meet, the Ponzi scheme imploded. Madoff confessed to his sons, who reported him to authorities. The scope was staggering. Thousands of investors lost money. Individuals, charities, pension funds, foundations. Some people lost their entire life savings. Several victims committed suicide. Charitable foundations had to close. Madoff pleaded guilty to 11 federal felonies in 2009 and was sentenced to 150 years in prison. He died in prison in 2021 at age 82, never showing genuine remorse. Recovering money for victims took years. A court-appointed trustee eventually recovered about $14 billion of the $65 billion in supposed account balances, though much of that $65 billion was phantom profits that never actually existed. What makes the Madoff scandal particularly galling is that it was preventable. Markopoulos handed the SEC a roadmap to the fraud multiple times. If they'd done their job competently, at any point between 1999 and 2008, the scheme would have been exposed years earlier and billions in losses prevented. The SEC's failure prompted reforms and an internal investigation that found the agency's examination of Madoff was conducted in a manner inconsistent with the Commission's investigative responsibilities. That's bureaucratic language for, "We screwed up badly." Madoff's Ponzi scheme proved that reputation and connections can let someone get away with obvious fraud for decades, even when regulators are warned repeatedly with detailed evidence. It showed that if you're trusted and respected enough, people will believe you even when the numbers don't add up. 3 Mile Island nuclear downplay. On March 28, 1979, the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, experienced a partial meltdown, the most serious nuclear accident in U.S. history. Cooling systems failed, fuel rods overheated, and radioactive gases were released. The initial response from the plant operators and government officials was to downplay the severity, creating confusion and panic that could have been avoided with honesty. The accident started with mechanical failures and was made worse by human error. A pressure valve stuck open, but instruments incorrectly showed it was closed. Operators, confused by misleading readings and inadequate training, made decisions that worsened the situation. The reactor core was partially exposed and damaged. Radioactive coolant leaked. Hydrogen gas built up, raising fears of an explosion. For the first day, Metropolitan Edison, the plant's operator, insisted everything was under control. They told the public there was no danger. Radiation releases were described as minimal. State and federal officials initially echoed these assurances. But information was chaotic and contradictory. Radiation alarms had gone off. Conflicting statements came from different officials. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission sent investigators and realized the situation was far more serious than the company had admitted. On the third day, as more information emerged about the core damage and radiation releases, Governor Richard Thornburgh recommended evacuation of pregnant women and young children within a 5-mile radius. The announcement caused widespread fear. About 140,000 people evacuated the area voluntarily, unsure if they were safe or in immediate danger. And the crisis dragged on for days with unclear and sometimes contradictory information from officials. Was there a risk of explosion? How much radiation was released? Should more people evacuate? The public didn't know who to trust because early assurances had proven false. The reactor was eventually stabilized without a catastrophic explosion or massive radiation release. Long-term health studies found no clear evidence of elevated cancer rates in the surrounding area, though disputes about health impacts continue. but the damage to public trust was severe. The initial downplaying of the accident's severity, followed by alarming new information, created exactly the kind of panic officials were supposedly trying to avoid. If they'd been honest from the beginning about the seriousness and uncertainty, the response could have been more orderly. But investigations revealed serious problems: inadequate operator training, poor instrumentation design, flawed emergency procedures, and a culture that prioritized reassuring the public over providing accurate information. 3 Mile Island effectively ended new nuclear plant construction in the United States for decades. Projects were cancelled. No new reactors were ordered for 30 years after the accident. Public opposition to nuclear power intensified dramatically. The accident also led to major safety reforms: improved training, better instrumentation, stricter oversight, and more robust emergency planning. The nuclear industry was forced to take safety more seriously. 3 Mile Island demonstrated that even in highly regulated industries with sophisticated technology, accidents can happen through a combination of equipment failure and human error. More importantly, it showed that downplaying a crisis in the early stages, when information is still unclear, often backfires by destroying credibility exactly when the public needs to trust official guidance. Church sex abuse scandals hidden worldwide. The Catholic Church systematically covered up sexual abuse of children by priests for decades across multiple countries and continents. When victims came forward, they were often silenced, doubted, or paid off. Abusive priests were quietly moved to different parishes where they'd abuse again. Church hierarchy prioritized protecting the institution's reputation over protecting children. The scale of abuse is staggering. Investigations have documented thousands of credible accusations against priests worldwide, in the United States, Ireland, Australia, Chile, Germany, France, and many other countries. The actual number of victims is likely far higher, as many never reported abuse out of shame, fear, or because they weren't believed. The pattern was remarkably consistent across different countries and dioceses. A priest would be accused of abusing children. Church officials would investigate internally, if at all. Instead of reporting to police or removing the priest, they'd quietly transfer him to another parish. The new parish wouldn't be warned about his history. The priest would have access to new victims. The cycle would repeat. Victims who reported abuse were often told to stay quiet for the good of the church. Some were pressured to sign non-disclosure agreements in exchange for settlements. Church officials would characterize abuse as isolated incidents rather than a systemic problem. They'd blame victims, suggesting children had somehow invited or misunderstood innocent attention. Documents revealed that church leaders, including bishops and cardinals, knew about abuse and deliberately hid it. They prioritized avoiding scandal and lawsuits over child safety. Some abusive priests were sent to treatment facilities, then returned to ministry despite recommendations they shouldn't have contact with children. The Boston Globe's investigation, published in 2002 and later depicted in the film Spotlight, was a watershed moment. Their reporting exposed not just individual abusive priests, but a systematic cover-up by the Boston Archdiocese. It sparked investigations and revelations worldwide. In Ireland, government investigations found endemic abuse in Catholic-run institutions, schools, orphanages, and reformatories, where children had been physically, sexually, and emotionally abused for decades. Church and state authorities had known and covered it up. Australia's Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse heard devastating testimony from thousands of survivors. They found 7% of Catholic priests in Australia between 1950 and 2010 had been accused of abuse. Some religious orders had abuse rates above 40%. The Church initially responded defensively, denying systemic problems and characterizing abuse as the work of a few bad individuals. As evidence mounted, they gradually acknowledged the crisis. Pope Francis eventually ordered investigations and promised reforms, though critics argue changes have been inadequate and accountability insufficient. Thousands of lawsuits have cost the Church billions in settlements. Dioceses in the U.S. have filed for bankruptcy protection due to abuse claims, but money doesn't undo trauma, and many perpetrators died before facing justice. What makes the Church abuse scandal particularly damaging is the betrayal of trust. Priests held positions of immense moral authority in communities. Parents trusted them with children. The institution that claimed moral leadership systematically protected predators and abandoned victims. And the scandal has contributed to declining church membership and authority in many countries. Trust has been shattered in ways that decades of apologies and reforms may never fully repair.